I believe that exposure is the most important part of photography. I believe that if you cannot master exposure, then you cannot take consistently good photographs. You want to learn why I believe this? Then keep watching. Before I can explain why exposure is so important, you need to understand what exposure is. And I'm going to explain this with a quote from my book on exposure. Photography is the act of capturing light. Exposure is the term used to measure how much light we are capturing. A correct exposure is when we have used just the right amount of light, so not too much nor too little, to create a pleasing result. Now, what might be pleasing to one person is not always pleasing to another, and therefore photography, just like every other art form, is subjective. So, as you can see, the term correct exposure can be ambiguous. Everybody sees the word slightly differently and has a different opinion on what is a correct exposure. If the intended viewer finds the image pleasing, then you can consider it to have a correct exposure. So why is it important to get a correct exposure? Well, quite simply, if your image is overexposed, too much light, or underexposed, not enough light, then it will be hard for the viewer to see the subject. If your viewer can't see the subject, then what is the point of the photograph? So here we have some photos. This was exactly the same scene taken on the same day, but with 5 different exposures. Each of these images is very different from the other. They each tell a different story. Looking at the image which is very underexposed, you can immediately see that there is something wrong with the image. You can barely work out what is around the edge of the image, and the only part which stands out is the clouds. Any person looking at this image would not find it pleasing, as they would be struggling to work out what else is in the picture. The very overexposed photo is bright, and you can only just see the clouds in the sky. A lot of the detail in the stone is also lost. This means that your viewer cannot see the complete scene properly and will therefore not find it pleasing. The other 3 images could be considered a correct exposure, depending upon which part of the scene the photographer was trying to highlight. So if they wanted to show all the detail in the clouds, they would potentially opt to slightly underexpose the image. If they were focusing on the tree and the shadow below it, then overexposing would produce the desired result. The correctly exposed image does give the best overall result, but encourages the viewer to focus on the stones. This is why I believe exposure is the most important part of photography. A very small change in exposure can have a very big effect on the story that the photo is telling. Dark photos often tell stories of sadness, loss, or fear. In contrast, brighter photos are considered happier, joyful, and hopeful. What I've shown you today is just the first part of my exposure book. The book also covers how to control your exposure using the exposure triangle, the light meter, and the histogram, as well as a lot more. If you want more details on this book, then check out the link in the description. I hope that you have found this video useful. If you have any questions, please just drop them in the comments for me. Other than that, I will see you again next week. Bye bye.